It is the morning of October 14th, 1944. The war is lost. Everyone in that house knows it, but nobody says it out loud, because the man sitting at the breakfast table is one of the most powerful soldiers in the Third Reich, and his name is Erwin Rommel. He is 52 years old. He has a fractured skull from a British Spitfire attack that happened just 3 months earlier in Normandy. His left eye still droops. He walks with pain. And today, 2 men in long leather coats are coming to his house in Herrlingen, a small village in southwestern Germany, to give him a choice. Stay with this channel. Because what happens in the next 24 hours is not a battle story. It is a story about blackmail, poison, and the most elaborate cover-up in military history. If you want to understand why, you have to go back to July 20th, 1944. That is the date of Operation Valkyrie, the failed bomb plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler inside the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. A briefcase bomb, a conference table, a blown-out window that saved Hitler's life by channeling the blast away from him. 20 people wounded, 4 killed. Hitler, shaken but alive. The Gestapo went to work immediately. Within days, they had names. Within weeks, those names led to more names. And one of those names, buried in letters and testimony pulled from tortured men, was Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the most popular German general alive. The man whose face had been on propaganda posters, whose victories in North Africa had been used to sell the war to the German people for 3 straight years. Rommel had not planted the bomb. He had not even been told about the specific plot before it happened. But he had known that a resistance existed. He had spoken with people involved. He had told his staff in the spring of 1944 that if Hitler was removed, he would make himself available to German leadership. That was enough. In wartime Germany, that was a death sentence. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because Hitler needed Rommel alive, or at least he needed the appearance of Rommel dying cleanly. You do not put Germany's most beloved soldier on trial for treason. You do not hang him from a meat hook like the other plotters, filmed while they strangled, which is what happened to many of the conspirators, including Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben on August 8, 1944. You do not do that to Rommel, because the German people would break. Morale was already collapsing. The Allies were pushing through France. The Eastern Front was a catastrophe. You needed people to keep believing. So Hitler devised something else, something quiet. By early October 1944, Rommel was recovering at his home in Herrlingen with his wife Lucy and his 15-year-old son Manfred. He was not yet well enough to return to duty. The skull fracture was serious. His body was healing. His mind was clear. And his mind was telling him that the visits from Berlin were becoming more frequent, the questions more pointed, and the friendliness more false. On October 7th, 1944, a general named Wilhelm Burgdorf and a general named Ernst Meisel arrived at Herrlingen for what was described as a routine welfare visit. Rommel spoke with them. The tone was wrong. He told Lucy afterward that something was coming. He did not know what. He wrote a letter to his son Manfred that same week. It was careful, measured, the kind of letter a man writes when he thinks it might be the last one. 7 days pass. October 14th, 1944, a Sunday. Rommel wakes up at his house on the hill above the village. The house is modest by the standards of senior Nazi officers. Rommel had never been a man for luxury. He had spent his career in tents, in command vehicles, and ruined towns. Herrlingen was simply the place his family lived. He puts on his uniform. He has breakfast with Manfred. His son is 16 now, actually, by this point, serving in an anti-aircraft unit. Manfred has been given leave to be home. That detail is important. Rommel arranged for his son to be there. He wanted to see him. Around noon, a car arrives. 2 officers step out. Burgdorf again, the general from the October 7th visit, and Meisel beside him. They come inside. Rommel sends his adjutant, Captain Hermann Aldinger, out of the room. He sends Lucy out of the room. He speaks with the 2 generals for about 30 minutes. When he comes back to his wife and his son and his adjutant, he tells them what was said. He has been accused. Letters and sworn testimony from multiple officers have implicated him in the July 20th plot. He is charged with being involved in high treason against the Führer. The charge carries the death penalty. The trial would be public. His family would suffer the consequences. His name would be destroyed. The German people would learn that their hero was a traitor. Or there is another option. The 2 generals have brought something with them, a small vial, potassium cyanide. He takes the poison. He dies within seconds. The official story is that he died of complications from his wounds sustained in Normandy. He receives a state funeral. He is buried as a hero. His family receives a full pension. His son is protected. His wife is protected. His name survives. Rommel goes upstairs. He changes into his Afrika Korps uniform. He puts on his medals. He picks up his field marshal's baton, the one he had earned in June 1942 after the fall of Tobruk, when Hitler had promoted him in the field, a gesture that had once meant everything. He comes back downstairs. He tells Lucy he will be dead in 15 minutes. He tells her not to show grief. He tells Manfred the same. He says his goodbyes. He shakes hands with Aldinger, who has served with him for years. Aldinger is crying. Rommel is not. He walks to the car. He gets in. He sits in the back seat between the two generals. The car drives away from Herrlingen down a country road lined with trees into the Blubberen forest. About a kilometer from the house, the car stops. The two generals get out. They stand outside. Rommel is alone in the back seat. He opens the vial. Potassium cyanide acts in under a minute when ingested, in under 30 seconds when it contacts mucous membranes. The field marshal, who had never lost a battle he was properly supplied for, who had outmaneuvered British forces across 600 miles of North African desert, who had slept in the sand and eaten the same food as his men, and driven to the front himself under fire, dies alone in the back of a car in a German forest. Within minutes, both Bergdorf and Maisel are on a phone. The cover story is activated. Rommel is dead. He died from his wounds. The next morning, October 15th, the news is released across Germany. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel has died of a brain seizure related to injuries sustained in the heroic defense of France. Adolf Hitler sends a personal telegram to Lucia Rommel expressing his deepest condolences. The Führer orders a state funeral. He orders flags flown at half-staff. He orders the German people to mourn. Chief of Staff General Hans-Georg Krebs, who had known the truth, signs the death certificate listing brain seizure as the cause of death. Bergdorf and Maisel return to Berlin. The two witnesses to the actual death were the SS driver and the two generals, and all three had been told, clearly, what would happen to them if they spoke. The funeral takes place on October 18th, 1944, in Ulm, Germany, just a few miles from Herrlingen. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt delivers the eulogy. He calls Rommel a great soldier fallen in the service of Germany. The crowd is enormous. People weep in the streets. Lucy Rommel stands at the coffin in her black dress. Manfred stands beside her. Neither of them says a word about what they know. That is not the choice of a broken man. That is the choice of a man who understood the situation with complete clarity and decided that protecting the people he loved was worth more than any gesture of defiance. But there is a layer underneath this that cuts even deeper. Because Rommel's relationship with Hitler had already been fracturing for over a year before the assassination plot. In June of 1944, as Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy on the 6th, Rommel had understood almost immediately that the campaign in France was unwinnable. He had visited the front himself, repeatedly, under fire, not because he needed to demonstrate bravery, but because he needed to see the reality with his own eyes. On July 15, 1944, just 5 days before the bomb plot, Rommel sent Hitler a formal report. It was blunt, in a way that almost no senior German officer dared to be by that point. He wrote that the troops were fighting heroically, but that the disparity in equipment, air power, and supply was insurmountable. He wrote that the military situation in the West must, in the near future, have terrible consequences if no political steps are taken. That phrase, political steps, was as close as a field marshal could come to writing to Hitler and saying, "End this war while we still have a Germany left to save." Hitler ignored it. 5 days later, the bomb went off at the Wolf's Lair, and Rommel was on a road in Normandy when a British Spitfire came out of the clouds and strafed his staff car at Sainte-Foy de Montgomery, which is in northern France in the Calvados department. The driver was killed. The car crashed. Rommel was thrown from the vehicle and fractured his skull in 3 places. He was unconscious for days. When he woke up, Germany had already started hanging the plotters, and his name was already in the files. The full truth did not come out during the war. It could not. The propaganda machine needed the story of the heroic death to hold for as long as possible. But in 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany and the Reich collapsed, the truth began to surface. Officers who had known talked. Documents were found. Lucy Rommel spoke. In 1950, Lucy and Manfred published their account. It confirmed everything. The two generals, the vial, the forest road, the 15-minute warning, all of it. Manfred Rommel, who later became mayor of Stuttgart, a city he would lead from 1974 to 1996, spent decades making sure his father's actual story was known. Not the propaganda version, the real one. And this is the part of the story that gets buried under the tactical genius and the Afrika Korps mythology. Rommel was not a saint. He had served the Nazi state. He had won victories for Hitler. His successes in North Africa had prolonged a war fought by a regime committing mass murder. He had, for years, been a loyal soldier of a government engaged in genocide. But there is also this. Unlike many senior German officers, Rommel had not been involved in the murder of civilians or prisoners. The British soldiers who fought against him in North Africa have said repeatedly that his forces followed the laws of war more closely than almost any other German command of that era. When he received an order from Hitler in 1942 to kill Jewish civilian prisoners captured in North Africa, Rommel did not comply. That order does not appear to have been carried out under his command. None of that makes him a resistance hero, but it complicates the picture. It makes him a man who existed in the machinery of an evil state, who served it for years, who eventually saw what it truly was, who tried, in the only way available to him, to signal that it had to end, and who paid for that signal with his life in a car on a forest road with a vial of poison pressed to his lips, while two generals stood outside pretending not to watch. The Third Reich lasted 7 more months after Rommel died. Hitler shot himself in his Berlin bunker on April 30th, 1945. Germany surrendered on May 8th. The war in Europe was over. Bergdorf, one of the two generals who had delivered the poison to Herrlingen, shot himself in Berlin on May 1st, 1945. One day after Hitler. He never faced any trial, never answered any questions. He died with the secret still technically intact, though by that point it did not matter anymore. Mezel, the other general in the car, survived the war. He was questioned by Allied investigators. He confirmed the basic facts. He said he had been following orders. He lived until 1978. The vial that killed Rommel was never recovered. The car was a standard Wehrmacht staff vehicle. The forest road outside Herrlingen still exists. People drive it today without knowing. The house in Herrlingen, where Rommel said goodbye to his family, has a small memorial plaque. It is a quiet village. The state funeral given to Rommel was, by any measure, one of the most cynical acts of the entire Nazi regime. Here was a man they had just murdered, being honored with trumpets and flags and a speech about sacrifice, while his widow stood at the grave knowing exactly who had killed her husband and why, and she was forced to stand there and say nothing, because the deal was that her son would live, and that deal was the only thing left that mattered. Manfred Rommel did live. He became a politician, he became mayor of Stuttgart, he worked across political divides. He died in 2013, 69 years after standing in that house in Herrlingen at 16 years old, shaking his father's hand for the last time. He once said that his father had gone to his death with his eyes open, that he had made a choice, that the choice had been made not from fear but from love. That is probably as close to the truth as any sentence can get. That announcement was written by a regime that had sent 2 men with poison to his house the day before. The man who ordered his death cried when he heard the news, or at least witnesses reported that Hitler appeared visibly moved when informed that Rommel had died. Whether that was genuine grief or performance for an audience, nobody alive today can say for certain. What is certain is this. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon on October 14th, 1944, in a car stopped on a forest road 1 kilometer from his house in Herrlingen, Germany, Erwin Rommel put the poison to his lips. He was dead before the 2 generals got back in the car. The whole thing took less than 5 minutes from when the vehicle stopped. That is how Germany buried its greatest general. Not with honor, not with a trial, not with any of the accountability that a man who had served at that level, in those conditions, under those pressures, might have at least demanded in a court of law. With a small glass vial, with 2 men in long leather coats standing outside a car pretending to look at trees, with the cover story already typed and waiting to be sent over the wires. Think about what it means that they had to do it that way. If Rommel had simply been a traitor, they would have tried him. They tried others. They filmed others dying. They made examples. The fact that they could not do that to Rommel tells you more about his actual standing with the German people than any propaganda poster ever could. Hitler understood that a public trial of Erwin Rommel would be more dangerous to the regime than losing another army. That is a remarkable kind of power, even stripped of every weapon in every command. And it was power Rommel never tried to use. That is the haunting part. In the weeks between the July 20th plot and October 14th, Rommel knew the net was tightening. His friends were being arrested. Officers who had spoken with him were being executed. The Gestapo was pulling threads. He was convalescing at home with a fractured skull and a drooping eye, and he could read what was happening. He was not a naive man. He had spent decades reading situations for a living. He could have run. Switzerland was not far. The border was less than 200 kilometers from Herrlingen. For a man with his connections, with his reputation, with officers who would have helped him, crossing that border was not impossible. It was dangerous, certainly. But so was sitting in a house waiting for 2 men with poison to arrive on a Sunday morning. He did not run, and he did not go to the Allies, which was a possibility that some historians have floated. The British knew his name, the Americans knew his name. An escaped field marshal offering intelligence would have been received with enormous interest by Supreme Allied headquarters. Eisenhower himself had spoken of Rommel in almost respectful terms during the North Africa campaign. That door was not entirely closed. Rommel did not walk through it either. What he did instead was stay in Herrlingen with his family, respond to the official communications with careful correctness, and wait. Whether he was hoping the accusation would somehow dissolve, or whether he had already accepted the outcome and was simply choosing to spend whatever days remained with Lucy and Manfred, is something only he knew. Manfred later suggested his father had been under no illusion, that by early October, Rommel had understood how it would end. There is a conversation recorded in Manfred's memoirs from the days just before October 14th. Rommel told his son that in 15 years of National Socialist rule, he had learned what it means to say no to Hitler, and that the lesson always ended the same way. He was not bitter when he said it, he was precise. That precision, that refusal to collapse into sentiment even at the end, is the detail that follows you long after you finish reading. He also left no final political statement, no manifesto, no letter to be opened after his death condemning the regime or calling on Germany to resist. Whatever he believed in those final weeks, he kept it between himself and the walls of that quiet house. The man who had written blunt operational reports across 2 continents, who had told Hitler directly in July 1944 that the military situation was beyond saving, went silent at the end. His final public act was getting into a car. The legacy that followed is complicated in the way that all honest history is complicated. For decades after the war, West Germany built something close to a Rommel myth. He was the good German general, the clean soldier, the man who had been murdered by Hitler, which made him, in a particular reading of events, almost a victim of the regime rather than a servant of it. Schools were named after him. Bundeswehr barracks carried his name. Streets in German cities still do. Critics pushed back on that myth hard starting in the 1990s, and they were right to do so. Rommel had enabled a regime engaged in systematic mass murder. His victories had served Hitler's goals. His loyalty had lasted longer than his doubts. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea that there were professional soldiers simply doing their jobs while the crimes happened somewhere else, had been used for decades to let too many people off the hook for too much. Both things are true at the same time. He was not innocent, and he was murdered in a forest by the state he had served because even that state understood that what he had become was something it could no longer afford to let live. He died at 1 in the afternoon. The leaves were turning in the Blaubeeren forest. The car was a gray Mercedes.